We tend to think World War II kicked off with one big event. But what if the real story is more like a 21-year-long fuse? A fuse that was lit the exact moment the last war ended. This is that story, the journey from one global catastrophe to an even bigger one.
So let's unpack those 2 decades after World War I and see exactly how the world went from celebrating peace to spiraling into its deadliest conflict.
Now, they called it the war to end all wars, but when it finally concluded in 1918, the peace that followed was, well, it was built on sand. It was incredibly fragile right from the very beginning.
On paper, the Treaty of Versailles looked like a new dawn. Old empires like the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman were just gone. And in their place, you get new countries like Czechoslovakia and Poland, built on this wonderful idea of self-determination. But here's the catch. While the treaty was promising freedom, its terms were also planting the toxic seeds of the next war, especially for Germany.
And this right here, this stab-in-the-back myth, was absolute poison for Germany's new democracy. It pushed this incredibly powerful story that the German army was never really beaten, but was betrayed by its own politicians. It made it almost impossible for the new government to seem legitimate or for people to accept the peace terms.
And to compound that political poison, you add an economic one. I mean, look at that number. On top of losing territory, its colonies, and its national pride, Germany was slammed with a debt that was just impossible to pay. This wasn't just a punishment. It was an economic ball and chain that was going to fuel anger and chaos for years.
So you have this incredibly fragile post-war world, already teetering under all this debt and resentment. Well, it was about to get hit by a global catastrophe that would shatter everything.
First, Germany is hit by this nightmare of hyperinflation. We're talking people's life savings becoming worthless overnight. Then, just as things start to kind of stabilize, the U.S. stock market crashes in 1929, and that triggers the Great Depression, which spreads across the globe like a plague.
This is so much more than a statistic. This is millions of people feeling hopeless, abandoned, and absolutely desperate. This kind of widespread poverty and unemployment creates the perfect breeding ground for extremist politicians who come along promising simple solutions and someone to blame. And right on cue, in this climate of total desperation, these new, aggressive, and fiercely anti-democratic movements start gaining terrifying momentum.
What's so wild is seeing these totalitarian states rising up in parallel. You've got Germany, Italy, and Japan. And while their ideologies had different names, Nazism, fascism, militarism, their core ambition was exactly the same: expand your territory through military force.
And you got to put yourself in their shoes. For a lot of people struggling, these aggressive regimes looked strong. They looked decisive. They promised to bring back national pride and, most importantly, jobs. And that was a very powerful message when you compared it to the democracies which just looked weak, chaotic, and totally ineffective.
The speed of Hitler's takeover is just breathtaking. He cleverly used Germany's own democratic system to completely dismantle it from the inside out. In just a little over 18 months, he went from being appointed chancellor to becoming the absolute dictator, the Führer.
Now you might be wondering, wasn't there supposed to be an organization to prevent all this? Well, there was. It was called the League of Nations, and it was about to face a series of tests that it would fail, catastrophically. So the first big test comes in 1931. Japan invades Manchuria. This is a clear-cut case of aggression. The world watches to see what the League will do, and its response is basically to write a strongly worded letter. That's it. This sent a very loud, very dangerous message to every other would-be aggressor out there.
And Japan's reaction to being condemned? They just packed their bags and walked out of the League. That moment just ripped the mask off the whole organization. It revealed that the League had no real power, no army, no way to enforce its decisions if a country just decided to ignore it.
So why didn't Britain and France step in? Well, they were paralyzed. The memory of World War I and its millions of casualties was a deep collective trauma. Their economies were a wreck because of the Depression, and honestly, they just completely underestimated these new dictators. They thought they could reason with them.
So Hitler, seeing that nobody was willing to stop him, got emboldened. He started making a series of aggressive moves that would push Europe right to the edge.
Every single one of these was a calculated risk, a test. He marches troops into the Rhineland, a direct violation of the treaty. Then he annexes Austria. Then he demands a piece of Czechoslovakia.
And with each success met only with protests, he got more and more confident that the West would never actually do anything.
This brings us to the infamous policy of appeasement. You know, it was born from a very real desire to avoid another horrible war, but in practice, it just signaled weakness. The high point, or low point, was the Munich Agreement, where Britain and France just handed Hitler a part of Czechoslovakia. It was supposed to guarantee peace in our time, but it really just convinced Hitler these guys would never fight.
And then came the final shock, the ultimate plot twist. Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union, sworn enemies, signed a deal. They secretly agreed to carve up Poland. This removed the last major obstacle for Hitler. The path was now clear, and a huge war was all but inevitable.
And sure enough, on September 1st, 1939, German tanks rolled into Poland, and the world was once again at war. So after all that, what can this tragic story teach us?
Well, it shows us it's never just one thing. It's a toxic recipe. You take unresolved anger from a past war, you add a massive economic collapse, you mix in the rise of aggressive ideologies, and top it off with a failure of diplomacy and a failure to confront aggression early. That's how you get a world war. And that's why understanding this history is so much more than an academic exercise. It's a vital tool. It forces us to ask tough questions about our world right now. How do we respond to aggression? How do we uphold international law? And maybe the most important question of all, are we recognizing the warning signs before it's too late?